So, chapter 419 of MHA is out, and wow, it's possibly the best chapter of MHA I've ever read. It's close, because I'm gonna be fully real with all of you. The way that the MHA ending was panning out, I hate it. I'll use the power of friendship to save you. Don't worry, I know there's still a kid in there. I wanted Deku to die. Listen, I get trying to save the kid inside Shigaraki, and I get that this is a story about superpowered teenagers going to a superpowered teenage school. But Deku, who's decidedly been sliding into a darker and darker character as time has gone on, as Deku has began to realize that the world isn't as black and white as he first thought it was, using the power of One for All to break through to Shigaraki's true self, to find that kid inside Shigaraki and change his life 30 years too late, just didn't sit with me right. Like, I got it, it was a very MHA ending, but I wasn't stoked about it. And so we really haven't been talking about MHA all that much on this channel, because I thought we all knew where it was heading. But I was wrong! And I don't love being wrong, but I love being wrong about things I want to be wrong about, and this was something I wanted to be wrong about. Because while for the last couple of chapters it appeared as though Deku was gonna break through to Shigaraki by sending each inheritor of One for All to Shigaraki's soul one at a time, which would slowly but surely allow Deku to get deeper and deeper into Shigaraki's psyche, just as Deku interrupted the scene of Shigaraki killing his entire family by catching Shigaraki's Decay hands, All for One appeared out of the ground and ate Shigaraki whole. And thus option reach out to Shigaraki seems as though it might be indefinitely delayed, as the MHA manga has decided to take a decidedly much darker approach to the end of this story. And I am all here for it. Not only in this chapter do we get the presumed death of Shigaraki and the unleashing of All for One back onto the universe, but we also got things like a grievous injury to Deku that he may never bounce back from. On top of that, the D-listers from Class 1A and a very important teacher have decided to burst onto the scene to battle against the strongest quirk user in history. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen, chapter 419 was packed with very unexpected action. From the front to the back of the chapter, every twist and turn is the last one you would have seen coming. And this chapter might be the most consequential and plot-changing chapter this universe has ever seen. And thus, we got a lot to talk about today, because today we're talking chapter 419 of My Hero Academia Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you love the idea of me talking about My Hero Academia, then you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And if you love looking like somebody who keeps up with the My Hero Academia manga, go ahead and meander on over into my merch store, otakusanonymous.net, where you can pick up some of the greatest anime t-shirts, sweatshirts, and sticker packs known to man. Woo! Where do we even begin with this chapter? Well, I do still, in my heart of hearts, believe MHA is going to end in the way that I've always anticipated that MHA is going to end, and that is Deku reaching out to Shigaraki and shaking him awake and bringing that child back out of him. This chapter has done a very good job of throwing a couple of wrenches in the cogs that is that theory. So what are the possible repercussions of All for One bursting back onto the stage with his newly ruined vessel? Does he have the strength to destroy the rest of this world in this emaciated, skinny vessel that he's currently occupying? Is Shigaraki truly dead and gone? And maybe more importantly than anything, does All for One now have One for All? Well, in order to answer all of those questions, we got to go over just what happened in this chapter. And then with the knowledge gleaned from this chapter, we can tackle once and for all what we believe is going to be the ending to this story. So chapter 419 picks up where chapter 418 left off. That is to say that a gigantic manifestation of All for One manifests in Shigaraki's psyche, and this gigantic manifestation is made from all of the things in Shigaraki's memories, most notably his house, his lawn, all that. What's important to note here is that the first thing that manifested was All for One's mouth, which ate the childhood Shigaraki that Deku was trying to save. And after this giant All for One is done manifesting, he says to a now falling and armless Deku, as let's not forget that Deku stepped between Shigaraki and his sister in order to stop Shigaraki from killing his sister and therefore the rest of his family. In order to stop that, he grabbed both of his hands, which caused both of Deku's arms to decay, at least in Shigaraki's psyche. It's at this point that All for One says, "You stole Yoichi and All for One from me." Yoichi being All for One's brother, the first inheritor of One for All. All for One continues by saying that by attacking Shigaraki psychologically, you allowed for me to emerge on the surface. It's at this point that we see Shigaraki, presumably inside of the giant All for One manifestation. And Shigaraki is falling into infinite blackness, disintegrating all the while. And it's at this point in the infinite blackness in front of Shigaraki appears All for One, who's telling Shigaraki that he's never decided anything in his entire life, and that his entire life that All for One was pulling the strings. And this moment confirms a long-standing theory in the MHA fandom. And this theory was some shade of the facts that All for One has been manipulating Shigaraki from the shadows his entire life to create the perfect vessel of hatred and anger to transfer his consciousness into one day to restart his life. And a big part of that theory is that All for One, through Dr. Garaki, who was notably the area's doctor for Deku and Shigaraki, stole Shigaraki's quirk as a baby and gave him the Decay quirk, knowing that when it awoke, it would lead Shigaraki to murdering his entire family, or something horrific. Basically, All for One knew it was going to lead to some trauma that would allow for Shigaraki to come under his care. And this theory is confirmed to be 100% true, as All for One tells Shigaraki that he twice failed to capture One for All, and that the first time that he tried to steal One for All was from Daijiro Bungo, the user of Black Whip, and the second time that he failed to steal it was from Daijiro Bungo's successor, again, the user of Smokescreen. And thus All for One came to the conclusion that he himself would not be able to steal One for All, especially now that users of One for All were getting stronger and stronger with every generation. Thus All for One decided that while All Might was gaining power and becoming an unstoppable force, All for One would begin to look for somebody mentally weak who he could control. And it's at this point that All for One, who still looks like a human, meets Tomura Shigaraki's father, Nana Shimura's child. And after befriending Shigaraki's father, All for One convinced him to have another child. Because even though Tomura's father already had a child, Shigaraki's older sister, she was already too big for All for One to control. Because mind you, All for One wants to get a hold of this child as a baby so he can swap out the quirks. And thus, because either All for One was incredibly convincing, or because Tomura Shigaraki's father actually wanted a second child, Shigaraki's father decided to have Shigaraki. And once Shigaraki was born, All for One took away his original quirk and gave him the Decay quirk. And thus, when Shigaraki was returned home from the hospital where he was born, where All for One was presumably parading around as a doctor, he had the Decay quirk, which was copied from somebody else by Dr. Garaki. However, what's interesting about the Decay quirk is that originally it wasn't just a Decay quirk. See, the Decay quirk actually used to work somewhat similar to Overhaul's quirk, as the quirk originally allowed the user to disintegrate anything they touched, but also to reconstruct anything they disintegrated. However, because Dr. Garaki and All for One didn't want to give Tomura a backdoor out of his trauma, they spliced the quirk in half and only gave Shigaraki the Decay half, which technically means, and I believe this might be an important plot point down the line, that somewhere, possibly in Dr. Garaki's lab, there is a half of a quirk that allows for somebody like Shigaraki to reconstruct all they've destroyed. And the half of that quirk might actually just be in All for One. It also means that there's somebody out there with Shigaraki's Decay quirk, but also the ability to reconstruct what's ever been decayed. And the fact that it's now been established that there is a reconstruction aspect to this Decay quirk, I feel may be important down the line, for a reason that will become somewhat obvious in a second. But all this is to say that All for One has been controlling Shigaraki's life from the moment he was born. And after this news is relayed to Shigaraki, we see Shigaraki disintegrating into an imaginary world with the faces of all the people he's ever disintegrated. And All for One reveals to Shigaraki, who's quickly disappearing from his own psyche, that All for One has now annihilated his psyche, a card he didn't plan on using until he officially re-seized control of All for One from Shigaraki. He then tells Shigaraki to disappear, at which point armless child Deku is launched out of Shigaraki's psyche imaginary space, which results in what appears to be a massive explosion in the real world. And once his imaginary world has collapsed, All for One, now in an emaciated version of Shigaraki's body, says Yoichi is no longer here, which I find interesting, because if we'll send our memories all the way back to chapter 417, Nana Shimura, the user of All for One before All Might, was the last to fly into Shigaraki's psyche, as she was able to stop her son, Shigaraki's father, from striking Shigaraki after he disintegrated their family dog. But this means that every single previous user of One for All is gone from Deku, which means that every single meta ability that was confirmed to Deku through tapping into the full strength of One for All is gone. No float, no smokescreen, no danger sense, no black whip. And this is because he's transferred all the previous users of One for All to Shigaraki. But one of the previous users of One for All is Yoichi. So if anything, Yoichi should be with All for One, unless somehow in the scuffle of Shigaraki's psyche being completely destroyed, One for All was bounced back to Deku, but that's not really conveyed. See, in essence, this should be exactly what All for One wanted. Deku knowingly and purposely transferred One for All, one inheritor at a time, into Shigaraki's body, which is now All for One's vessel. So their consciousness should be intertwined intertwined. And since All For One is in charge of the body, he now has full control over Yoichi. But maybe since the inheritors were transferred to Shigaraki, who was supposedly destroyed, all the previous inheritors of One For All that lived in Deku are now gone. For the moment, we can't really say. All we can say is after emerging from the smoke, All For One says my midterm plan is no longer feasible, which is referring to Shigaraki being his next body, the next vessel that would allow him to live another 150 or so years. And after saying that, he hears an echo in his head, to which he screams silence at and grows a hand, the hand that Shigaraki used to wear all over his body, over his mouth. This is rather obviously supposed to show us that Shigaraki's not actually gone, and Shigaraki, possibly when provoked by Deku, will now have even more reason to battle back against All For One. And thus the idea of Deku reaching out to Shigaraki and them teaming up against All For One is now as possible as it's ever been, because Shigaraki's gonna go through a massive identity crisis built on the fact that All For One literally made every decision for him his entire life. Thus, the Shigaraki that he became was All For One's fault, and so he'll have a choice in what Shigaraki he wants to become in the future, which could be word for word what Deku will say to him. But as it currently stands, All For One now has complete and total control over Shigaraki's body. However, the psychological attacks launched on him by Deku and all the previous inheritors of One For All have had massive repercussions to his physique, which is very clearly evident. He's emaciated. Beyond just being emaciated and possibly weaker than Shigaraki was, All For One also mentions that the hatred, the anger, and the disintegration quirk have all disappeared from this body, which leads All For One to the conclusion that Shigaraki is finally dead, and that the vessel that he crafted in Shigaraki over the course of Shigaraki's entire life is ruined. He then once again hammers down the fact that his little brother is no longer there either, which kind of solidifies the idea that all the previous inheritors of One For All that were in Deku went with Shigaraki's psyche when it disintegrated into nothingness, and therefore it's probably safe to assume that All For One doesn't have things like Black Whip and Smoke Screen and Danger Sense, but he does have access to all the quirks that Shigaraki had access to, minus Decay, which albeit was Shigaraki's strongest quirk. We then cut to Deku, who's laying on the ground, and he yells at All For One. It's at this point that All For One tells Deku that he's going to move on to the final stage of his plan, taking over the entire world. Deku tells All For One that he won't let it happen. And it's at this point that I really wish All For One responded with, "You and what arm?" Because it's revealed that the arms that Deku lost in his hand-holding competition with Shigaraki and Shigaraki's psyche were his real arms. And thus now, back in the real world, Deku doesn't have arms. And this panel is gritty. It will absolutely be censored in the anime. And honestly, are we surprised? And are we surprised? Deku's arms, more than any other person, have been death flagged from the start of this manga. Whether it was Deku breaking his fingers and then double breaking his fingers, or breaking his arms and then double breaking his arms, and Recovery Girl saying if you keep breaking your arms like this, you're not going to be able to use them anymore. And so Deku had to adapt his fighting style to the shoot style and therefore focus on attacks with his legs. It has been very evident for a long time that Deku at some point or another was gonna lose access to his arms, because that was the big key difference between him and All Might. All Might had incredibly strong arms, and so he could channel One For All through his arms. But Deku, with his very well noted weaker arms than All Might, had to channel his powers through his legs. And if Recovery Girl wasn't able to fix breaks in Deku's arms, I don't think she's going to be able to make him regrow two of them.
But does this mean Deku's gonna be armless forever?
I mean, like, maybe, obviously. Would I massively prefer that Deku remain armless forever? Yes, 100%. Taking Deku's arms and then giving them back to him is no different from death baiting. It's just death baiting his arms. Though, did we literally in chapter 417 get an entire scene of Eri trying to run to the battlefield to heal Deku? Yeah, and while yes, obviously in 417 it was established that 1, there was no way to get to the battlefield, and 2, her rewind power hadn't recovered yet, but if you give Eri a couple of months to get her horn nice and long, she can just give Deku his arms back. But if you don't want to go the Eri route, there's also the solid possibility that somewhere out there, there's the other half of Shigaraki's quirk, which is the reconstruct bit. Let's not forget how Deku lost his arms in the first place. So possibly when Shigaraki decides that all of his villainous thoughts were put in his brain by All For One, and therefore he realizes that everything he's destroyed he should rebuild with the other half of his quirk, the reconstruct half, the first thing that he reconstructs is good old Deku's arms. Deku then has some flashbacks of all the times he took his arms for granted, which if you're asking a recovery girl was all too often. And even after realizing that he now can count to the grand total of 0, Deku says no, it's not over. And in a sense, he's not wrong. The majority of his strongest attacks come from his legs, but Deku can only use 45% of One For All, and that's on a good day, and the only way he was able to reach 100% usage of One For All was through the usage of all of his meta abilities. And mind you, this boy, before diving into Shigaraki's psyche, was literally holding his entire body together with Black Whip. And so if he gets up and fights, after already using Gear Shift too many times to the point where he had to hold his body together with Black Whip, and takes on All For One with no goddamn arms, then I'm just gonna assume all the previous inheritors of One For All didn't know what they were talking about. Because my boy Deku was pulling a Tanjiro and has been on his last breath for 40 chapters, and now he needs somebody else to unzip his pants for him when he needs to pee. I get that the main character isn't supposed to give up, but the way that Gear Shift has been talked about the entirety of this battle against Shigaraki is that using it once and not finishing the battle would be a bad idea, but using it twice and not finishing the battle would spell the end of Deku. Now Deku got over the fact that he used Gear Shift twice and didn't beat Shigaraki by wrapping his entire body in Black Whip, and that was cool because it made him look demonic, but if he can't do that anymore and also can no longer give a hug, how is he gonna bounce back? And if he does, consequences mean nothing.
Oh, Nick, you just want Deku to die.
Yeah, kind of. Not that I dislike Deku, I like him as an MC, but come on, we need consequences. This is assuming that Deku is able to fight. If he just loses his arms, that's plenty of consequences. However, I'm not the only one getting philosophical at this moment, because in response to Deku losing his arms, All For One says, usually people say when you lose something, it makes you stronger, but you, from the start, had nothing. Now look at you, which is a mean thing to say to somebody who now only can use bidets, but fortunately All For One was planning on putting Deku out of his misery, and thus he begins to close the distance between him and Deku with his hand extended. But before All For One is able to close the distance on Deku, the real strongest hero from Class 1A shows up on the scene. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen, it's Sero. I wish I was kidding. Literally, Sero bursts onto the scene and wraps up All For One with his elbow adhesive tape, and looks, admittedly, kind of badass while doing it. All For One then realizes that he didn't feel Sero approaching because he feels so irrelevant when he's standing next to Deku. That is to say that Sero's presence is so non-intimidating to Deku that he didn't even come up as a potential threat, even though Sero was flying in to take down All For One. Now, this might also confirm the fact that All For One doesn't have all of Deku's meta abilities, as if All For One did in fact have all of Deku's meta abilities, he would have Danger Sense. In Danger Sense, even though Sero isn't necessarily a threat to All For One, probably would have told All For One that Sero was on the way. Sero, after wrapping up All For One in what I assume will be the equivalent of trying to stop Godzilla with wrapping paper, yells at Deku and says, "Don't worry, we're here." And who's we? Sero, Ojiro, and Sato. For those of you who don't know all the names of the members of Class 1A, that's the adhesive elbow tape boy, Sero, the guy whose quirk is Tail, Ojiro, and the guy whose quirk is weaponized diabetes, Sugar Rush, Sato. I've always believed that Sato should be stronger than he's given credit for. One, for a 16-year-old, he's absolutely stacked. Actually, aren't they in their first year of high school? He might be 14. While the way that he activates his power is rather silly, needing to chug a bunch of sugar, the dude is massive, and in this panel where he's appearing, he looks the biggest he's ever been. I mean, I kid you not, he looks All Might sized. And while I'm not sitting here and saying that Sato is gonna have strength on par with All Might, because obviously the strength of All Might's body just allowed him to fully access One For All strength, what I am saying is that more likely than not, we're gonna see the strongest ever version of Sato we've seen, which may not amount to much in a battle against All For One, who has quirks that are able to nullify basically all physical impact, but this war arc in MHA has given growth to a lot of characters that we never really believed would get growth, like Dupla Arms and Any Voice in their battle against the monsterized Spinner. And while these three have been at least tangentially present in a lot of the important battles during this war arc, these three specifically haven't been given a moment to shine. See, Araka and Froppy got their battle against Toga, Todoroki got his battle against Dabi, Tokoyami literally fought All For One and Kagentamakia, Ida played a massive role in those same fights, and so on and so forth. Even characters from outside of UA have played massive roles in these very important fights, but Sero, Sato, and Ojiro really have sat on the sidelines, which means one, that they never got a time to shine, and two, that they're probably the healthiest out of anybody on the hero's side of this war, as they really haven't tried to play hero yet. Now, does this mean that the MHA manga is going to come to a close at the hands of Sero, Sato, and Ojiro? No. because it's gonna come to the close at the hands of Sero, Sato, Ojiro, and Aizawa. Because after Sero wraps up All For One with some tape, and Ojiro hits him with a tornado tail, and Sato hits him with a sugar knuckle, all three of which are well known to be the strongest attacks in the MHA universe. From a portal, very clearly created by Kurogiri, and we'll talk about that in a second, emerges Aizawa. And I say emerges because let's not forget, Aizawa has one leg. So he's kind of just like standing in front of the portal, probably because they didn't want to show him like hopping on one leg. That would have been embarrassing. But it's also important to note that even with Aizawa there, this isn't exactly a crack squad because, like I've already established, Aizawa not hugely mobile. On top of this, it's already been established that since losing one of his eyes, Aizawa isn't able to use his erasure quirk nearly as well, which is why in the initial battle against Shigaraki on the giant floating UA device, instead of using Aizawa, they used Aizawa in combination with Monoma, who has the ability to steal the quirks of those he's in contact with, so they just sat Monoma next to Aizawa. Now, does this mean that Aizawa can't use his erasure quirk at all? No, probably not. They wouldn't have sent him if he couldn't. But it does mean that he'll probably only be able to use his erasure quirk for a fraction of how long he could use it prior. Especially when you consider the fact that outside of the Kurogiri portal didn't also hop the guy whose entire ability was to make sure that Aizawa's eyes were kept wet. So all in all, we have a weaponized diabetic, a furry, a guy with tape as an ability, and a one-legged, one-eyed teacher. Oh, and Deku, who just became a permanent tank top wearer. All in all, not the squad I would have chosen to battle against All For One, but let's not forget what All For One established in the beginning of this chapter. One, the vessel that he's currently occupying is destroyed. Shigaraki's body is emaciated. He's basically weaker than he was in his old body, and he's definitely weaker than Shigaraki was, as he's also lost access to the Decay quirk, which was undoubtedly the strongest quirk that Shiga AFO had. I guess it would be Shiga FO. So looking at this as a full-powered All For One against the D-listers of Class 1A isn't exactly accurate. Now, does that mean that this squad stands a chance against All For One? Not necessarily, but also this may not be the entirety of the squad that's gonna battle against All For One. See, the bigger reveal than Aizawa showing up on the battlefield is how Aizawa shows up on the battlefield, which is through the medium of Kurogiri's warp gate. And now I won't blame you if some of you forget what Kurogiri's last appearance in this manga was, because it was almost a year ago. Because the last time that Kurogiri appeared in the manga, it was chapter 380. However, in chapter 380, Kurogiri protects Aizawa. See, when Aizawa is falling off the giant floaty UA thing that they built to battle against Shigaraki, Kurogiri is going through kind of a personal crisis where he's like, I'm a protector, but of who? At which point he opens a warp gate that presumably saves Aizawa. But this is the last time that we saw Aizawa. But at that moment, we didn't know if Kurogiri was actively trying to save Aizawa or take him off the battlefield. So we didn't know what side Kurogiri existed on. But it appears as though the person inside of Kurogiri has remembered that Aizawa was one of their childhood friends and has therefore come to the side of the good guys. And therefore, it's a possibility that we're going to have an Avengers Assemble moment where Kurogiri gets every single person who can still fight to enter in the battle against All For One, after which they're able to beat down All For One to the point where Deku, with just his legs, is able to deliver some semblance of a final blow, which will probably come hand in hand with a Shigaraki reawakening of sorts that freezes All For One in his body for a second, that allows for Deku to land that final hit. Because the second that All For One said, oh, there's still an echo, it all but guaranteed that Shigaraki is going to come back into the story through the capacity of inconveniencing All For One, and that inconvenience will more likely than not lead to All For One's end. After that moment, it'll be up to Horikoshi to decide whether or not he believes that the things that Shigaraki have done are worthy of redeeming or not, as I genuinely believe that it's a 50-50 coin flip between Shigaraki either retaking over All For One's body or dying along with All For One. Personally, I'd like for Shigaraki to die in a moment of redemption, but that's just who I am. But do you guys think these are viable endings? Do you believe that it's really going to come down to Shigaraki inconveniencing All For One? And do you think Kurogiri joining the side of the good guys will be the final nail in the coffin for All For One? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. We get a good chapter of JJK and a good chapter of MHA on the same day. That's so much reaction to do.